Hi everyone, my name is Lisette Coly and I serve as president of Parapsychology Foundation. And it gives me great pleasure to bring to you another in our continuing series of Book Nook author interviews. Today we're going to have the chance to sit down with Shannon Taggart to discuss her recently published book of photographs and commentary entitled Séance, published by Fulgur Press. Shannon is an artist photographer based in Brooklyn. Her photographs have been exhibited and featured internationally, including within such publications as Time, New York Times Magazine, Discover, and Newsweek. Her work has been recognized by Nikon, Magnum Photos, and the Ingram Marath Foundation, American Photography, and the Alexia Foundation for World Peace. She has been scholar and artist in residence at the Morbid Anatomy Museum. And we at Parapsychology Foundation are very proud to have early on recognized her talent and dedication to her art, and thus awarded her in 2017 our Rogo Award for Parapsychological Media. In part also with PF support, she traveled to Murcia, Spain, to interview and photograph two of the most important figures in modern spiritualism, Robin and Sandra Foy. Séance, with its cache of incredible photographs, consists of a foreword by Dan Aykroyd, the famous actor and beloved Ghostbuster, who's well versed in the subject, as was his father, Peter Aykroyd, who wrote in 2009 the book A History of Ghosts, which graces the shelves of the Eileen Garrett Research Library. Of great value to readers and researchers are contributions within the book by Tony Ausler, writing on notes on mysticism and visual transects, as well as commentary by curator Andreas Fischer in a selection, A Photographic Journal into the Realm of Spiritualism. Shannon herself presents an introduction, Spiritualism, Photography, and the Search for Ectoplasm, followed by The Stories, which readers will find fascinating. I was touched personally when she saw fit to start her introduction with a quote from my maternal grandmother, Eileen J. Garrett, saying, quote, I asked those spirit figures if I was seeing them, or if I was seeing what was in my own brain. They answered, both. That quote, like all the content in Shannon's book, Séance, provokes exciting conversations and thoughts. I could go on, and fair warning, I guess by now you figured out that I'm a fan. I'm very happy to have over the years formed a warm friendship with her. And so before I turn it over to her interview, for her to speak for herself, I want to share a quote from Andreas Fischer in the book, who I think just about sums it all up, saying, Shannon Taggart's photography is unique, yet it models itself on a long-standing tradition. Taggart's aim, or better put, mission, is to document contemporary manifestation of spiritualism by photography, creating a project that is practically unparalleled in history. She's one of the few photographers with a professional background even to have dedicated time to documenting this genre, and in her case, the work is all the more extraordinary by virtue of having been created in a significant period both of her life and that of the world in general. We at Parapsychology Foundation agree, and to have this magnificent tome depicting the fruit of her labor and insightful commentary is truly a treasure. You really must try and get your hands on it, a copy for yourself, so you can see what all the media interest is about. And we do so hope that Séance has people taking note of our fascinating and complex phenomena, stimulating and resulting in more research. So let me now bring you Shannon Taggart. All right, well, here we are with Shannon. So my first question is, let's clear up, what is spiritualism?
Spiritualism is an American-born religion that believes that we can speak with spirits of the dead through the act of mediumship.
Okie doke. And why do you think recently now it seems like more people are interested in spiritualism? Apart from Halloween, of course.
Right. Well, there was recently an exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum on the spiritualist artist Hilma af Klint, and it was one of the most popular exhibitions they've ever had, and the catalog sold very well. I think it's partially due to discovering that these female artists like Hilma af Klint and Georgiana Houghton actually were the first abstract artists, and they predate Kandinsky, who's considered the father of abstract art, in Houghton's case, by 50 years. And I think that this realization that the very birth of modern art is related to spiritualism has gotten creative people interested in spiritualism again and looking at it and learning about it. I think it's our times. We've got a very
so apart from the art world, I mean, it's,
right. But I think politically, there's all this upheaval, and it's almost a very liminal time. And so I think in these times,
we're searching or whatever. No,
parapsychology and psychic studies, and that becomes more of interest during times of strife. And so I think spiritualism included. Also, there's a lot of brave academics who are reassessing the history and now publishing on, because often it was written out of the history books. Spiritualism has this very intense, valid intellectual history that was kind of marginalized,
swept
under the rug. It's embarrassing. We don't want to talk about that stuff. I mean, Anne Brodie, the person who wrote the quintessential book on women's rights and spiritualism, she wrote in the second edition in the foreword or the preface of her second edition that her academic colleagues were horrified, that she wanted to sully the women's rights movement by acknowledging that spiritualism,
muddy the waters,
was a big part of it. In the media, academia and the media have a hard time dealing with the reality of psi or mediumship, it all goes into the fiction, entertainment, these things.
All the hyperbole and the special effects and
spiritualism and such topics flourish in fiction and entertainment, but is really marginalized when you try to talk about the reality of it or people who practice it. To be fair, the history of spiritualism is rife with hoaxes and fraud and people being busted for false mediumship or magic tricks. So, but to me, this just makes the history more fascinating and something more complicated to think about and study. And why is that? Why is there always like fraud appearing alongside with some compelling stories about mediumship?
It's not always all or nothing, is it? I mean, it's always a mixture, a melange of truth and
yes, there are theories that the fraud is part of it. It's an embedded part that you will never cleanse out. That maybe it's the way the phenomena hides itself or keeps people away from it. Maybe maybe there's something inherently. The trickster archetype is embedded in all of this stuff, so you can't ever get pure, true or false in these scenarios.
Well, let me ask you how contemporary mediumship that we see on television all the time or whatever, how does contemporary mediumship differ from Victorian mediumship?
So generally, what spiritualism is today is very much like what you would see on a television show like The Long Island Medium. A woman just speaking in a well-lit room. Maybe there's some candles, tissue boxes. No trances, just like a clean conversation. No lights off, none of that stuff. But traditionally, there were always these dark seances where people sit in circles in a room, and sometimes the mediums sit in a thing called the medium's cabinet, which is supposed to condense energy. These sessions are kind of to induce physical effects. And within spiritualism today, there are two ways of thinking. One being the way forward is through consciousness, it's through mental mediumship, it's through pure clairvoyance. None of this dark room stuff, we don't need this is past. It's about healing and it's about clairvoyance. And then there's others who say, no, dark seances have always been part of spiritualism since the very beginning, and it's an important part, and we should still be doing those as well, and that they are equally as important. So there's a lot of tension between those two movements within spiritualism, and it's something I try to, in my work, try to give voices to both. And it's been tricky to do that, and I kind of refer to myself often as the diplomat of spiritualism, because there's different ways to
navigate these two different channels.
Yeah, about how spiritualism should move forward now. I mean, what do we do now? I mean, it was an incredibly popular movement at one time, and it's kind of waning.
Mm. Well, where is the movement now, or what would be a hotbed or a seat of spiritualism? I mean, in spiritualist churches, or are there any locations?
Yeah,
Specifically?
I found I started my work at Lilydale, which is the world's largest spiritualist community, which is still a functioning spiritualist camp, or it's actually a hamlet, a small hamlet with homes, and but that's pretty much the biggest one in the United States. In England, there are many more spiritualist churches than there are here in the United States. There's a lot more interest in spiritualism there. And there's a place called the Arthur Findlay College, which is kind of, I would call it the world hub for spiritualism. And it operates as a spiritualist learning center. And you can go and take week-long courses on anything related to mediumship. And people come from all over the world to study there. And it's run by the Spiritualist National Union in England. And I found that in England and Europe, there seems to be much more interested in spiritualism as a practice than there is here in the United States.
Any ideas as to why that would be? I mean, is it just the culture?
In the United States, it's more, there still is an interest in spiritualism, but we don't call it spiritualism. It's called the afterlife community. Oh. There's bestsellers like Eben Alexander's book, which, and these are people who don't identify as spiritualists and are not connecting to that history, but are still interested in mediumship and seances.
But not in an organized fashion as the
right, and it's kind of disconnected from the history, which I think is sad that there is more of this movement nowadays, but it's not connected to the spiritualist history of America. It's completely separated.
So that's perhaps why spiritualism, can we say, has been somewhat marginalized, at least over here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the heyday of spiritualism was roughly 1848 to, I would say, like 1933 in there. And I think a lot of the reasons it got marginalized was because of the fraud. And at one time in the beginning, there was real hope that we would prove spiritualism. Spiritualism was an effort to merge religion and science. And when it first came about, there were all these scientific discoveries like germ theory, radiation, invisible communication through the telephone and the telegraph. There was a real hope that we would also be able to prove spirits in the spirit world and the afterlife. And people tried very hard, and there was very inconsistent results.
All righty, well, why don't we get down and dirty and actually get to the stuff that a lot of people raises eyebrows, and let's discuss physical mediumship. Now, what's that per se?
So physical mediumship is the style of the dark seance, which was popular in the Victorian era, and it's when people sit in dark rooms and try to create physical effects, like table tipping would be considered physical mediumship. Trumpets that float, spirit voices, full materializations, the substance of ectoplasm.
Oh, well, let me stop you because everybody's interested in ectoplasm. So what is ectoplasm? Do we know?
Ectoplasm is a substance. It was actually named by Charles Richet, who was a Nobel Prize winner in medicine. He was trying to describe the phantom limbs he encountered with the famous medium Eusebia Palladino. So he theorized that it was this ectoplasm was a substance, a spiritual substance, and it's literally a physical substance that merges the material world with the spirit world. It merges.
Acts as a bridge?
Yeah, bridges life and death. And the belief is that ectoplasm, can take many forms. Like it's been described to me as like water can take many forms. So, water can be steam and ice and, just plain water. And that's how spiritualists believe ectoplasm works. It could be invisible. It could be a steam. It could come and show a form that looks like cotton. And it's pulled from the medium's body. So it's also considered a dangerous substance, and it's considered
dangerous to who? To the medium,
to the medium,
not to the sitters, not in the seance room.
Well, and also some spiritualists believe that ectoplasm is also drawn from the bodies of the sitters, and it combines with
Oh,
with the
really?
medium, and also it depends on who you talk to. As with anything in spiritualism, there's no hierarchy, there's no text. People are practitioners and they do things their way, and so
The ectoplasm, in your experience, has always been in dark light, then in dim light,
yes,
because
yes,
it's harmful. Is it for the medium to be in light? What was that? That's awfully
so ectoplasm is
convenient, right?
is light sensitive, and it is believed that it could be very dangerous for a medium to have their ectoplasm out in the seance room and a light goes on, and then they say it can cause burns or internal injuries. The famous medium Helen Duncan is, I would refer to her as a spiritualist martyr, and it is believed that she died because the police raided her seance room when her ectoplasm was evident, and she was carried away, and she died a few weeks later. So it is believed that by many that the reason is because they got to her when she was in trance and very vulnerable with her ectoplasm. Then you ask other mediums, and I have a quote. I've quoted in my work one medium, Helen DeVita, who said, "I just don't believe that spirit would let you work with a substance that can kill you just because some idiot turns the light on in the room."
I like that.
And so you have that too. There's a lot of lore surrounding ectoplasm, and it's considered dangerous, and only the most developed mediums can produce it. And
It doesn't hang around for long, does it? I mean, in my experience.
yeah, it's supposed to retract back into the body, and so like what comes out must go back, and that's the theory. So that's why it's so dangerous, because it has to travel back in.
Well, what's the old talk about regurgitating cheesecloth and things like that? Yeah.
Yes. There's a whole host of seance protocols that have been put into place and because of these protocols, often if you see seance images, they look like stage magic or bondage videos, depending on, sometimes they bind the mediums, would force vomiting, would do cavity searches. There's a whole very fascinating history regarding how do you prevent fraud in ectoplasmic situations. And one of the original treatise is by Baron Schreck-Notzing, Phenomena of Materialization, and that vintage book describes all of the protocols that went on with the medium Eva C. and how they were invading her body in various ways, and yet she could still produce this ectoplasm.
So this is really physical mediumship as opposed to mental mediumship that, say, Eileen Garrett was a mental medium. It's an interesting dichotomy, the two kinds of mediumship.
Yes, and it's rare to find people who do both kinds.
There seems to be, all or not,
all
whatever,
or
yeah. Well, how is spiritualism and photography connected? I mean, let's talk about that connection, and then how you got into the whole
Well,
area.
That was fascinating for me to discover, because as a photographer approaching the topic of spiritualism, at the time I was a straight documentarian, I found that there was this wild history of overlap between spiritualism and photography, and it's almost as if they came about around the same time. And they were introduced to the public in the same city, Rochester, New York. That's where Kodak gave photography to the masses, and that's where the first public seances were held, literally down the same street. And when spiritualism began, people were trying to prove spirits with cameras. They were using photography to try and prove mediumship, prove the spirit world. They had a belief that photography would be able to show us the unseen.
Is that the Mummler work? I mean, what time period are we talking about?
So 1848 spiritualism begins. William Mummler, the first spirit photographer, appears in 1864. And he starts making these images of people seated in parlor settings with the spirits of their dead relatives, and he was put on trial for fraud. And at the time, this was the first moment where the photographic reality is really called into question, that maybe photographs show a different reality. Maybe what they document is not technically real, or real in the way that
we understand
real. And so I like to say that spiritualism and photography, through their dialogue, exposed each other. They exposed all their complications with objective
That's a good title
truth.
for your next book, Exposed.
Exposed.
I like it.
Yes.
Not bad.
They, you know, spiritualism learned about itself by trying to document with photographs, and photography was revealed all of its complications through these efforts to photograph spiritualism and try to prove the spiritualist principles. So,
Well,
yeah,
do you come from? Were there a lot of photographers who came after Mumler who preceded you and have been interested, or really was the whole quest laid aside until you've popped up?
Well, this was explained to me by the curator Andreas Fischer, that
Who's in your book, right?
He contributed an essay to my book. He explained to me that my work is unique in the sense that there's never been a professional photographer who focused so broadly on spiritualism. Early on, it was mostly they're trying to photograph the phenomena and they're trying to study it and document the phenomena.
To catch it.
They're using it in, like, trying to be scientific. And there were a lot of people experimenting with photography. I mean, William Crookes, one of the most famous scientists of all time, who also was an expert in photography, was the first person to photograph spiritualist materializations. You know, there was a lot of experimentation.
That Glenn Hamilton collection?
The G.G. Hamilton collection.
But those weren't photographers per se that were, they were using cameras,
used photography. There was a lot of intellectuals and scientists who tried to use photography to prove spiritualism. So it was less artists, it was more scientists trying to use photography. And unfortunately, a lot of those materials were considered silly, and a lot of them were
pitched,
and what we have left, a lot of it is held at the IGP archive in Germany, where Andreas Freiberg, Hans Bender's, Hans Bender, the parapsychologist, saved a lot of these materials. And also too, when I studied photography extensively, the history, I really did for 4 years of college, and never once did I see any of these images in any history book.
Really?
This whole history was kind of written out of the history of photography, which made me even more compelled to study and
well. Let me ask you: How did you get ensnared in this net? I mean,
so when I'm from Buffalo, New York, which is about 60 miles from Lilydale, and when I was a teenager, my cousins would go to Lilydale to the message services, where you sit on a bench anonymously, and mediums pick out people and give them short messages. And my cousin went, and a medium picked her out of the crowd and told her the story of how my grandfather was there, and he wanted us to know how he really died, and gave these details about a death by choking. And my cousin said, this didn't happen. My grandfather died of brain cancer. And she came home to her parents, who were my aunt and uncle, and told them, oh, this crazy woman told me this story at Lilydale about Grandpa's death. And they said, no, that's true. It's actually a true story. It was something happened in the hospital, and he actually did choke.
Aspirated or whatever.
He aspirated, and the family never talked about it. It was just, he died of brain cancer. And so those details were revealed, and I was a teenager at the time, and I thought, how could somebody possibly know that? And it always stuck with me. It just really unsettled me. And so then...
So it wasn't the photography that drew you. It was the phenomenon.
No, I had no idea about the photography aspects. When I went to Lilydale, I was working as a photojournalist for newspapers, and then I was doing some PR photography, and I just wanted a project to work on one summer to make a photo essay about this quirky little town where my cousin got this message.
Yeah,
isn't this sweet? And I was completely taken aback by discovering the photographic history of spiritualism and all of that imagery. And I realized, like, wow, this religion was the first religion to do an iconography with photography rather than painting. But I started to contemplate these images as like religious iconography rather than like, oh, they're just failures at proof. Because they communicate the teachings and the ideas of spiritualism, and also the images are I often say they're the most absurd and uniquely unsettling images, I think, in the history of photography. They're like ridiculous.
They elicit a response. I don't know, different responses, but they're
absurd. They're unsettling. They're enigmas. They make no sense. When I saw these images, I was like, I have to understand what was going on. What are these supposed to mean? What is supposed to be happening here? Because they're so strange. And also discovering that spiritualism had this badass intellectual history. I mean, the women's rights movement was deeply involved. Many of the famous minds of late 19th, early 20th century were fascinated and experimenting with spiritualism, including Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln and his wife. The Curies sat in on seances and studied table tipping. I mean, and, this stuff blew my mind. And in anything I ever studied.
So you're not a believer per se. You weren't on a mission to.
Right. I was open-minded. I didn't know what I was going to find there. I thought maybe I would figure it all out in a couple weeks.
Sorry for laughing. Okay,
I know. Yeah. Here I am 18 years later, finally. And I don't have any answers. I just have more questions.
So you haven't you're not leaning one to the next, or
I always say, one big soup? It depends on the day you ask me. But I have to, honestly, I've had very profound, shockingly accurate messages and strange experiences, and really, truly have been shaken to my core at some of the things I've documented and experienced. And I've also seen the most ridiculous, patently, what seemed to me to be patently phony experiences as well. I mean, my experiences span the gamut.
Can you share some of the ones that would have knocked your socks off?
So there's this couple I've done a lot of work with, Sylvia and Chris Howarth, and they live in the north of England, and they have a seance space in their home, and they're both mediums, and they share this seance space. And Sylvia never sits in the dark, and she said, I just never sit in the dark because when I do, things happen the next day in the kitchen.
So she's not a physical medium?
She is a physical medium, but she just doesn't sit in the pitch black dark. Okay. She'll sit under red light or blue light or different colored lights. So for whatever reason this night she decides to sit in the pitch black. So we're all in the pitch black of their seance room. And as soon as the lights go off, I could hear hundreds of little knocks going up and down the wall, and I could not figure out, I did not feel that they had rigged it up. I could not figure out how it was happening. There was a drum in the hallway that played itself, or it sounded like it was being hit, and then we did the seance, and then it was done. And then the next day I was in her kitchen and I was making myself a cup of tea, and I grabbed this solid ceramic knob on her cupboard, and I pulled the cupboard open. And as I touched the knob, it felt like it was electric, and it exploded in my hand. And half of it shot
apart.
It exploded apart, and half of it went up and hit the ceiling and crashed down. The other half became razor sharp, and I looked at my hand, and it was bleeding. And it was cut very deep, and I screamed. And then the husband, Chris, the other medium, comes running in. What happened? And he just put his hand up near it, and all of a sudden he was bleeding too. And we're just standing looking at each other. And she said, "Yeah, weird things happen in the kitchen the day after I sit in the dark." And I mean, I don't know what to make of that. I have a scar to this day. I get the chills just even thinking of the feeling of touching that knob, because it felt electric.
Was it warm to the touch? You don't even remember. I'm just so shocked at the moment.
Yeah, it just exploded. It felt like I touched electricity or something. And it was a baked knob. I mean, it wasn't, something that could have been broken and glued together or anything like that. It was a solid ceramic knob. So that was really strange.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of that, but it's a story.
Well, I know within Séance, the book, you have a section called the stories or stories. Is that one of them, or?
Yes, that's one of the stories. So with pictures, you can tell stories, but it's in a different way from words. And actually, the publisher, Robert Ansel, encouraged me to write the stories, and I had no intention of doing that. I was just going to present my photographs, and he said, "No, I think people really want to know the stories behind the images, and then so I ended up writing a text of 30,000 words, which for me, as a new author, that was a pretty big undertaking. I also did 60 interviews, so I was able to like revisit and interview a lot of the people who I've been working with for a long time now. I mean, it's been 18 years. Unfortunately, a lot of the people I first started photographing are now gone. But I did have a few recorded interviews that I was able to draw from, and also some notes. I wish I had done more recording early on, but early on I just thought it was
You didn't
a
know you were
photography
going
project.
on this path, right?
But one of my favorite parts is the stories, because I get to tell the things I can't say in the pictures, which are these profound experiences that many of the people in the pictures are having while I make the picture, or that relate to the pictures that I've made. And also I get to tell a lot about the history. I kind of, the stories are anecdotes and history kind of
But
weaved
you embedded in the whole.
Yeah, and the book became this 3-part book. The first part is essays that frame the history and the importance of spiritualism and the history of spiritualism and photography. Then it's my images, then the stories. I became enmeshed in the history, and I was like, felt like I was responding to it and building on the history of the past, but I very rarely met anybody who knew anything about spiritualism. So it was important to me in the book to make sure you know about spiritualism before you see the pictures.
Well, I think to put frame of reference, otherwise it's just, what is she on about?
Yeah, I don't think you can really understand the pictures unless you understand something about the history of spiritualism. So I was able to draw from the artist. Tony Orsler wrote a wonderful essay, and he has a huge collection of spiritualist material.
Published a fantastic book.
Yes,
I know it's in the Garrett Library.
Yeah, fantastic book called Imponderable. But he has this huge collection of all sorts of paranormal material, but a lot of spiritualist material. And he very graciously allowed me to draw from that, and also wrote a fantastic essay about why spiritualism is important in art. And then Andreas Fischer at the IGPP archive in Freiburg, he allowed us to use images from their archive, and some of them have never before been published. So I was so lucky for that. And also he lent his vast knowledge of the history of spirit photography, and wrote an essay kind of placing my work in a historical context, which
very helpful.
Yes. And then I wrote my own introduction kind of explaining how I got into this and where I'm at with it, and how I think about spiritualism, and kind of tell the story about the Fox sisters, which and how it all started. And then Dan Aykroyd wrote a foreword. The famous actor and beloved Ghostbuster. Yes, because I think a lot of us, I mean, myself included, the first time I ever heard Ectoplasm was through Dan Aykroyd's Ghostbusters. And his family are spiritualists. He's a 4th-generation spiritualist. And actually, I was so lucky to be able to use an image of his great-grandfather, a spirit photograph taken in Lilydale, tying that to the history, tying Ghostbusters to the history of spiritualism. I think he wrote Ghostbusters as a direct response to finding his great-grandfather's
Well, his
Seance
father
material.
Also was an author, right? And wrote a history of ghosts.
And Peter Aykroyd, Dan Aykroyd's father, wrote a wonderful book called The History of Ghosts. And he talks about Eileen Garrett a lot in that book. I think there's like a whole section on Garrett. So he wrote this wonderful book in 2009 that kind of delves into the history. There's some parallels between his work and mine, because he's telling personal stories interweaved with the history.
Well, I think it's so valuable when you put the human touch on it. It's one thing to read case histories and this and that, but to really have, quote, normal people that are interfacing with this complex phenomena, it makes it all the more palatable.
And the stories that you hear at places like Lilydale. I mean, I've met countless people who's like, I never thought I'd come here to a place like this, and I'm only here because I had this absolutely mind-blowing experience during the loss of a loved one or a near-death experience, and they had no other place to go to kind of discuss it or to process it. So Lilydale kind of holds the space for spiritualist camps, churches, places like Lilydale. They hold the space for this human phenomena that happens to many, many, many people. And I mean, a lot of times too, you get people off the record and they'll tell you their spooky stories.
At the bottom of the bed. If I go to conferences or whatever, you hear all the good stuff. You don't,
right.
People don't cup to that.
I think almost everybody has a spooky story.
Uh-huh.
Something, or it
Has
happened
anybody,
to them or their parents or their brother.
Has anybody ever suggested that you might be an agent, that you are drawing this stuff to you when you're in the sitting, that you, a lightning rod for these kind of things?
That I'm a medium, but I just use a camera. And,
a channel.
And I definitely do try to play with manifesting, visuals that resonate with the invisible experience, like through my images. But I get to do it in the realm of art, so I'm not focusing on proof. And for some spiritualists, that's confusing, because most spiritualist efforts are to create evidence. I mean, they give readings because they believe that is evidence. They're trying to give evidence of life after death. And that's one thing a point I should make, is that spiritualists do not believe that they are occultists, or they're not into magic or witchcraft, and they believe that they are Western rationalists who are just trying to prove and give evidence of life, of the continuation of life, that we don't die, of life after death. So that's where they're kind of just.
So they don't mind you being somewhat, with your camera, being a voyeur into their world.
Well, I mean, also too, I've built relationships with everybody I've worked with. So, and it's been so long, so that. But in the beginning, I knew nothing about spiritualism, and they very graciously welcomed me and taught me about mediumship and about spiritualism. And I think it's because they knew I was genuinely interested and genuinely curious, and that I wasn't trying to
gotcha journalism or
do
something
an expose.
Like that, yeah.
I was just trying to see what was happening, what was there, and I was trying to relate my, being a person who had never seen a ghost or talked to spirits, and I hadn't even had a reading but by the time I got to Lilydale. But I believed them that they were having profound experiences, and I wanted to know more about it, and I became really fascinated. I think the general stereotype is that these are all fraudulent people who are just trying to make money.
Exactly.
And I found that was not the case for most of what I saw. I saw genuine practitioners who considered themselves grief workers and
fulfilling a needed role.
Yes, trying to facilitate
help.
Healing. With the process of and make the connection between life and death, and help people process their experiences, help loved ones speak. They describe it as they are given information from spirits who want to pass information along in this world. That's mostly what I found, was genuine practitioners who were not making a ton of money. They were doing it because it was a calling.
Well, have you taken a lot of flack professionally in the photography world, per se? I mean, the art world is somewhat been introduced to you now with Séance, but how do you...
Yes, I mean, I think always if you make any of these topics too real, there's always an attraction-repulsion element to these.
There's a fear of side, right? If it gets too close for comfort,
yeah. So I think for many
back.
People, my images of my work and the way I'm focusing, where I'm not trying to make fun of this or disprove it, makes people uncomfortable. But a lot of people are very interested and love the work. But I have gotten kicked out of photo editors' offices, and I was, told very bluntly in graduate school that that my topic of spiritualism was not kosher.
Comme il faut, and it wasn't going to fly.
I would be receiving an MFA with this topic, and so I left.
Well, good. Who's going to have the last laugh? Let's see. So as we sort of bring this into a close, tell me what's on the books next. I mean, are you and your camera still roaming around?
Yes,
what do you
I
have
have
to do?
I'm more interested in the topic than ever, even though I've just compiled this tome of 18 years of work. The book is out, and I'm so excited for it to be out. And I absolutely am so proud of the way it all came together and the material in the book. And the collaborations I was able to do with Dan Aykroyd, with Tony Orsler, with Andreas Fischer, with Fulgur Press. The book is printed beautifully. I'm very happy with the way it's presented. Very thankful to the designers, Douglas and Voss, who made a beautiful design. And I think that there's a lot of material to dive into. And even the book even sometimes surprises me when I think about the connections that are interweaved between the texts and the images. So just very proud and want everybody to see it. And
Well, we certainly suggest people do that, and we pat ourselves on the back at PF that we thought years ago in 2017 that you were onto something. And so we've watched your career, and now to have this treasure trove actually in hand is really great. So we thank you, for actually following through.
Yes, the only grant I received, and I did write a lot of grants and tried my hardest, and it was no photography grants came through. It was only through the PF, so I am eternally grateful for that.
Just like the PF, onwards and upwards, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Shannon, very much. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Lisette Coly. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation. So welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.